I'm going to read a little thing from this book here. More of that later. Following the destruction of Tokyo, in which most of the city center was scorched black, and following the enthusiastic endorsement of American newspapers, including the curiously named Christian Century, General LeMay swiftly sent his bomber fleets to attack virtually every other city in Japan. Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, Yokohama, and over 60 other large targets were thus treated to the nightmare of firebombing. And simply because a city had been bombed once was not a guarantee that it would not be bombed again and again. Such was the terrible fate of Tokyo. Not content with the initial massacre, LeMay demanded that the Japanese capital be attacked until everyone and everything was utterly destroyed. Burned down, demanded the U.S. general, wiped right off the map. Fortunately, no community was any better prepared to face the attacks than Tokyo had been. Fully expecting that if the U.S. Air Force ever attacked, it would be with typical high explosives, local and national authorities encouraged Japanese civilians earlier in the war to dig their own air raid shelters near or under their houses to withstand the blast and shrapnel of conventional bombs. Additionally, women were encouraged to wear heavy cloth hoods over their head to cushion a bomb's concussive force and prevent hearing loss. Oh, that's interesting. After Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, and other firebombing raids, however, it was clear that the past defensive tactics were useless when facing the hellish firestorms. Typically, first warning of a potential American air raid came with the city sirens. Like their German counterparts earlier in the war, the Japanese likewise sprang from their beds with every such alarm, either to join the various bucket brigades or to wet their mats and brooms and fill their water troughs just in case of fire. Most simply dashed to the holes in the ground they called shelters. But also like those in Germany, with numerous false alarms came predictable apathy on the part of the Japanese and an almost utter disregard of sirens. Often when a few B-29s on reconnaissance were indeed spotted far above, leaving their vapor trails, excited air wardens would run through the streets beating on buckets as warning to laggards. But soon even these warnings were ignored, right? They were really high. As the B-29s came over us day in and day out, we never feared them, admitted one woman, weary of the alarms. That all changed dramatically following the firebombing of Tokyo. After that night, especially on dry, windy nights, in each Japanese city, in each Japanese heart, there was never any doubt that the war, a hellish, hideous war, had finally reached Japan. First hint of an impending American air raid in a Japanese city soon came with a low but ominous rumble from afar. That menacing sound soon grew and grew to an approaching roar that caused the windows to rattle and the very air to vibrate. Finally, in one great burst, a terrible continuous thunder exploded just overhead. In no way, however, did that horrible sound prepare the people below for the horrible sight they then saw above. Usually at night, but sometimes even during the day, the sky was literally blotted out by the sight. I had heard that the planes were big, gaped the stained spectator, but seen from so close, their size astounded me. Gigantic, thought one spellbound viewer. Enormous, added another awestruck witness. It looked as if they were flying just over the telegraph poles in the street. I was totally stupefied. They were so big, remembered a young woman staring in disbelief. It looked like you could reach out and grab them. Then amid the terrifying sights and sounds, the awestruck people watched in utter amazement as the bomb bay doors of the frightening things sprang open as if on cue. Falling not vertically, but diagonally, the objects which then began to shower down were first thought by many viewers to be pipes or even sticks. Within a few seconds, the true nature of the objects became known to all. "They're coming down," the people screamed. "They're coming down." Almost immediately, as if a switch had been thrown from every corner of the targeted city, the night became light as day as each of the thousands of firebombs ignited on impact. Quickly, the deadly liquid spread, and in mere minutes the targeted city was totally engulfed. "At that moment," said 24-year-old Yoshiko Hashimoto, "we were caught in an inferno. The fire spread so quickly, the surroundings were seized with fire in a wink. The wind and flames seemed to feed into each other, and both gained intensity," described one teenager. "Pots and pans blew about on the ground, and blankets flew through the air. People ran in all directions. Since their homes and businesses made of wood and paper were mere matchboxes ready to ignite, most people recognized instantly the futility of trying to fight the fire, and they quickly fled into the streets. Roofs collapsed under the bomb's impact," said an eyewitness, "and within minutes those frail houses were aflame, lighted from the inside like paper lanterns. It was at a terrifying moment when the entire world seemed on the verge of being consumed by smoke and flames that single mothers, their husbands dead or off at war, were forced to make life and death decisions. To save small children, some were compelled to leave old, feeble relatives behind. Others had to abandon beloved pets or needed animals. One mother, to save her two tiny tots, made the heartbreaking decision to leave her handicapped child to certain death. The three of us dashed out into the panic and pandemonium of the streets, recalled Masayoshi Nakagawa, a father of two little children, and a man whose wife was in the local hospital expecting their third child. People were carrying whatever they had managed to salvage: quilts, pillows, frying pans. Some of them had carts, others had lugged bicycles on their backs. Once in the streets, the refugees were greeted by a red blizzard of sparks. Unlike typical sparks, however, those created from the incendiary bombs were large chunks of oily, wind-driven flame that would instantly ignite the clothes of those fleeing. Another hazard was the hail of bombs themselves. So many of the relatively small bombs were dropped on any given city that many victims were actually struck by them. Most, of course, were instantly wrapped in a ball of fire and died in terrible agony. One woman watched in horror as her husband ran from the family business shouting, air raid, and was immediately struck in the head by a firebomb. He was instantly wrapped in a sheet of bluish flame, recounted the horrified wife. I could not put out the fire. All my desperate efforts were of no avail. His hair was still sizzling and giving off a blue light. His skin peeled away in sheets, exposing his flesh. I could not even wipe his body. Just as with the man above, those victims who actually came in contact with napalm found that the fire could not be extinguished and would burn and sizzle all the way to the bone. Desperately, those trapped within the encircled target zone searched for avenues of escape. Unfortunately, at every turn, the victims met only more fleeing refugees and more smoke and flame. Those who had remained at their own air raid shelters near their homes were already dead, the holes acting like earthen bake ovens in the heat. Others met similar fates when they wrongly assumed that the few brick and concrete buildings in the city would protect them. They did the opposite. When the racing flames reached such buildings, those inside were quickly incinerated. Iron rafters overhead set down a rain of molten metal on any still alive. Nor did parks prove to be havens. With temperatures reaching 1800 degrees, the trees quickly dried and burst into flames. Additionally, those who sought out open spaces or areas burned bare from previous waves were easy targets for U.S. fighter pilots who routinely machine-gunned fleeing refugees, just as they had done in Germany. Other American aircraft watched the streets for any Japanese fire companies bold enough to attempt to fight the fires, and then attacked with high explosives. By the hundreds, then thousands, then tens of thousands, the people fled through the streets as the furnace became fiercer and fiercer. Hell could get no hotter, thought French reporter Robert Goulain, as he watched the crowd struggle against the murderous heat and the hail of huge flaming sparks. People soaked themselves in the water barrels that stood in front of each house before setting off again. A litter of obstacles blocked their way: telegraph poles and overhead trolley wires that formed a dense net of tangles across the street. The fiery air was blown down towards the ground, and it was often the refugees' feet that began burning first. The men's puttees and the women's trousers caught fire and ignited the rest of their clothing. As noted, in the furious heat and wind, it was often the victim's shoes or boots which erupted in flames first, followed quickly by the pants, shirts, and air raid hoods that many women still wore. As the horrified people stripped off one layer of burning clothes after another, many rolling on the ground to smother the fires, some simply burst into flames entirely. Hair, head, skin, all. One witness watched as child ran by screaming shrilly, "It's hot, it hurts, help me!" Before anyone could reach him, the child burst into flames as if it had been drenched in gasoline. In the midst of her own desperate bid to escape, one teenage girl saw a mother and father bravely place their own bodies between the killing heat and their small children. At last, when the father simply burst into flames, he nevertheless struggled to remain upright as a shield for his children. Finally, the man teetered and fell. I heard him shouting to his wife, recalled the witness. "Forgive me, dear, forgive me." Likewise, thousands of victims in other Japanese cities could not bear the ferocious heat and simply exploded in flames from spontaneous combustion. The streets, remember the police cameraman Ishikawa Koyo, were rivers of fire, flaming pieces of furniture exploding in the heat, while the people themselves blazed like matchsticks. Under the wind and the gigantic breath of fire, immense incandescent vortices rose in a number of places, swirling, flattening, sucking whole blocks of houses into a maelstrom of fire. Continues French visitor Robert Goulain. Wherever there was a canal, people hurled themselves into the water. In shallow places, people waded half-sunk in noxious muck, miles just above the surface of the water. In other places, the water got so hot that the luckless bathers were simply boiled alive. People crowded onto the bridges, but the spans were made of steel that gradually heated. Human clusters clinging to the white hail railings finally let go, fell into the water, and carried off on the current. Thousands jammed the parks and gardens that lined both banks of the river. As panic brought ever fresh waves of people pressing to the narrow strips of land, those in front were pushed irresistibly towards the river. Whole walls of screaming humanity toppled over and disappeared in the deep water. With his two little children clutched under his arms, Masayoshi Nakagawa raced for the canals and rivers as everyone else, hoping to find a saving from the deadly heat. Suddenly I heard a shout, "Your son's clothes are on fire!" At the same instant I saw flames licking the cotton bloomers my daughter was wearing. I put my son down and reached out to try to smother the flames on his back, when a tremendous gust of wind literally tore him from me and threw me to the ground. Struggling to stand, I saw that I was now closer to my daughter than to the boy. I decided to put out the fires on her clothes first. The flames were climbing her legs. As I frantically extinguished the flames, I heard the agonized screams of my son a short distance away. As soon as my daughter was safe, I rushed to the boy. He had stopped crying. I bent over him. He was already dead. Grabbing his daughter and his son's body, Masayoshi joined the fleeing crowds again, once trying to escape the ever-pursuing inferno. Once in open space, continues the grieving father, I stood by my daughter by my side, my dead son in my arms, waiting for the fire to subside. Surprisingly, during days and nights such as these filled with nightmares scripted in hell, children bursting into flames, glass windows melting, molten metal pouring down on people, often it was the small and seemingly trivial sights and sounds that sometimes stayed with survivors forever. One little girl, after watching a panicked mother run past with her baby totally ablaze on her back, after seeing her own children her own age rolling on the ground like human torches, after seeing and hearing the sounds of a man and a horse he was leading, both burning to death, still again and again the little girl's mind wandered back to the safety of her cherished doll collection, then on display at a local girls' festival. To my surprise, recalls another survivor, birds in mid-flight, sparrows and crows, were not sure where to go in such a situation. I was surprised to see that the sparrows and the crows would cling to the electric wire and stay there in a row. You'd think they'd go into the bushes or something. Amid all the horror, another woman never forgot the strange sight of a refugee standing in a large tank of water holding only a live chicken. Another young female, immediately numb to it all, found as she passed a mound of dead bodies that her eyes had become transfixed on a pair of nose holes that seemed to be peering up on her. Finally, on numerous occasions, because of the American encirclement of a target city, thousands of refugees fleeing from one direction collided head-on with thousands of refugees fleeing from another direction. In this case, the panicked multitude, now incapable of moving forward because of an equally panicked multitude in front, and incapable of moving backwards because of the pursuing firestorm, simply became wedged so tightly that no one could move. Horrific as the ordeal had been thus far, it was nothing compared to this final act of the hellish horror. Soon most refugees were fleeing instinctively towards water. Many crowds became wedged on bridges. Thousands of victims were thus overtaken by the fury and were burnt to a crisp by the fiery winds that to some of them resembled flamethrowers. Thousands more, horribly burned, managed to leap or fall to their deaths into the rivers and canals below. Eventually, metal bridges became so hot that human grease from the victims above poured down on the bodies of victims below. And as for those far above, to those who had dropped millions of firebombs on the cities and towns of Japan, the horror show they had created below was readily apparent in all its lurid detail. At such low altitudes, with night now day, those above had a front row seat to all the hellish drama below. Fleeing humans racing for life down streets now more rivers of fire than streets. Screaming horses engulfed in flames, galloping in all directions. Bridges packed with doomed mothers and children. Rivers and canals jammed with the dead and the dead-to-be. For those U.S. fighter pilots whose job was to massacre refugees who reached the open spaces, their view was even closer. In the red and white glares of the fire, these Americans could actually see the faces of those they were machine gunning. The women with babies, the children running and falling, the old, the slow, the animals. The violent updrafts from the heat below was a much greater threat to the bombers than the almost non-existent Japanese anti-air defenses. Wafted on heat thousands of feet up was the scattered debris from below, bits and pieces of homes, offices, schools, tatters of burnt clothing, feathers and fur from dead pets, and of course the pervasive smell of broiled flesh. Suddenly, way off at 2 o'clock, noted an awestruck American pilot arriving on the scene. I saw a glow on the horizon like the sun rising or maybe the moon. The whole city was soon below, stretching from wingtip to wingtip, ablaze in one enormous fire, with yet more fountains of flame pouring down from the B-29s. The black smoke billowed up thousands of feet, bringing with it the horrible smell of burning flesh.